No one knew what the Mafia Boss was saying, until the Black Maid surprised him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. The grand dining room of the Valentino mansion exuded an air of opulence. The long, polished oak table gleamed under the soft, amber glow of the chandelier. Crystal glasses were neatly arranged, each catching the light in a way that made them sparkle like diamonds. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. At the head of the table sat the man himself, Dominic Valentino, the mafia boss who controlled more than half of the city's underground operations. His broad shoulders and sharp features made him an imposing figure, and his calm demeanor only added to the power he wielded. His guests, a mix of powerful businesspeople and old-money elites, sat around him, exchanging polite pleasantries. No one dared to break the silence until he spoke. At the far end of the room, a young woman, dressed in the plainest of Maid uniforms, moved quietly between the guests. Her name was Marissa. She had only been working at the mansion for a few months, but in those few months, she had learned more about the world of the rich and powerful than she ever cared to know. She kept her head down, her eyes focused on the tasks at hand, never daring to look up, especially not at her employer. But today was different. As she walked past the table, her ear caught snippets of a conversation. At first, it was just a blur of voices, but one word stood out. Corruption. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that word. It was the reason her family had been destroyed, the reason her father had been framed and sent to prison. As she set down the wine glasses in front of the guests, she heard another word, betrayal. Her mind raced. She had been taught to keep her mouth shut, to remain invisible. But something inside her clicked. The mafia boss, the one who held the power to destroy lives with a single word, was discussing something dangerous, something personal. Marissa glanced toward Dominic, catching his eye for just a brief moment. He was deep in conversation, his face cold and unreadable, his voice smooth and commanding. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, but something inside her urged her to act. As she moved toward the other side of the room to serve the last of the drinks, she felt a strange pull. It was as if everything in her life had led up to this moment. Without fully understanding why, she found herself moving toward the table where Dominic sat. She paused for a moment, standing beside him, her breath caught in her chest. Her hands were shaking as she placed the wine bottle down in front of him. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The conversation stopped. Everyone's eyes were on her now, and Dominic's dark eyes narrowed in her direction. He could feel her presence, feel the tension she brought with her. Marissa, never one to speak out, finally found her voice. "Excuse me, Mr. Valentino, but there's something you're missing," she said, her voice trembling but clear. The room seemed to freeze. Dominic's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. The power in his gaze sent a chill down her spine, but she didn't back down. She could feel the weight of everyone's expectations, their judgment, but she knew she had to speak. "What do you mean?" Dominic's voice was low and cold, but there was an edge to it, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Marissa took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "The clause you're looking at, it's not what you think. It's a trap." She watched as his expression shifted, the slightest flicker of surprise in his eyes. No one had ever dared to speak to him like this, especially not someone in her position. The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited for his response. For a moment, it seemed like he might just ignore her, dismiss her as another inconsequential servant. But then, to her shock, he leaned back in his chair and motioned for her to explain. "Go on," he said, his tone almost curious now. The other guests were quiet, their eyes fixed on her. Marissa took another breath and began. "The language in the contract, it's deliberately vague. It leaves you open to manipulation. It gives them power over you without you even knowing it." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Dominic didn't speak. His eyes studied her, calculating. Then, slowly he nodded. "Interesting," he said, his voice still calm, but laced with something else, something that Marissa couldn't quite place. "How do you know this?" His question was simple, but the weight behind it made her nervous. She had only ever been a maid, nothing more. Yet here she was, speaking to the most powerful man in the city, as if she were on equal footing. Marissa hesitated, but then the words came. "I used to be a lawyer," she said quietly. "I know how to spot a trap." The silence in the room was deafening. No one could believe what they had just heard. The Mafia boss's eyes widened ever so slightly, and for the first time, there was something resembling respect in his gaze. "You're a lawyer?" he asked, his voice soft, but the surprise in it was undeniable. She nodded, her voice steady now. "I was, until I lost everything." The room remained silent as the full weight of her words settled in. The Mafia boss, the man who controlled empires, was stunned into silence by a maid who had dared to speak the truth. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of this turn of events. And Marissa, the quiet maid, stood there, knowing she had just done something that could change everything. Marissa stood still, the weight of the room pressing in on her as all eyes remained locked on her. The Mafia boss, Dominic Valentino, leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. The silence was suffocating, and Marissa could feel the tension in the air. She had just spoken to the most powerful man in the city, and now the consequences of her words were still hanging over her like a storm cloud. She had never expected this, never imagined that her small act of courage would shake things up so profoundly. But here she was, standing in front of him, about to explain herself in a way she had never planned. Dominic finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. "So, you were a lawyer?" he asked again, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of deception. She nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, Mr. Valentino. I was. But that was before." She hesitated, the weight of her past threatening to overwhelm her. She had never spoken about her fall from grace to anyone. The words felt foreign on her tongue. "Before I lost everything," she finished quietly. Dominic's eyes softened for a brief moment, but only for a second. "And you think you can help me?" he asked, his tone now curious, almost respectful. Marissa wasn't sure if it was the respect she had earned or the curiosity that it sparked in him, but she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long while. "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I know how to read contracts. I can spot the things that people like you are too busy to notice." Dominic studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, without a word, he motioned for her to sit. "Explain it to me," he said. Marissa took a seat, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew that this was her moment, the one that could change everything. If she could help him, if she could prove her worth, she might find a way out of the life that had trapped her. She opened the contract again, her fingers trembling as she pointed out the clause that had caught her eye. "This one," she said, her voice growing more confident. "It gives them the ability to take over without you even knowing it. They can claim you violated terms that aren't even clear, and you would be at their mercy." Dominic didn't interrupt. He simply watched as she continued to explain, her mind moving faster than she could speak. She had done this for years, reading through contracts, looking for the traps, the manipulations that hid in the fine print. She could see the power moves hidden behind the legal jargon, the ways people could be forced into a corner without even realizing it. As she spoke, she noticed Dominic's gaze softening even more. He was listening, really listening, and for a moment, she forgot where they were. She forgot who he was. "You're right," he said quietly, after a long pause. "This is a trap." Marissa looked up, surprised. She hadn't expected him to agree so easily. "Yes," she said softly, nodding. "It is. And you're the one who would end up paying for it." Dominic leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "And how do you know this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion, though not as harsh as before. "Because it happened to me," Marissa replied. "It's why I lost everything. I trusted the wrong people, signed the wrong contracts, and they destroyed my life." There was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, but it was gone so quickly, she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. Dominic sat back again, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through hell," he said, almost as if to himself. "And yet you still have the courage to speak up." Marissa swallowed hard, the memory of her fall from grace weighing heavily on her. "I had to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've learned to trust my instincts. And I trust them now." For the first time since she had entered the room, Dominic smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I see, he said, his voice quieter now. You have more courage than most people I know. That's rare in this world. The words hit her harder than she expected. In a world where people were used to betrayal, corruption, and power games, courage was a currency she hadn't realized she had. It felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She hadn't come here to seek redemption, but maybe, just maybe, she could find it. Dominic leaned forward again, his expression shifting to something more intense. I need someone I can trust, he said, his voice steady and firm. Someone who can see things that others can't. Someone who won't back down when the stakes are high. Marissa met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words settle on her chest. She knew what he was offering. She knew what it meant. I can help you, she said quietly. I'm not afraid to take risks. Not anymore. Dominic studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm going to make you an offer, Marissa, he said, his voice even lower now. You can continue working here, but I'll give you more. You'll work directly with me, handling things no one else can. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. I'm offering you a position, one that comes with power and responsibility, he continued. But you'll have to prove yourself first. She nodded, knowing that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The offer wasn't just about work, it was about survival. She could finally take control of her life again, even if it meant stepping into a world she had only dreamed of. Dominic stood up, offering his hand. Welcome to my team, he said. And just like that, everything had changed. Marissa wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a player in a much bigger game. Marissa walked through the grand halls of the Valentino mansion, the weight of her new role settling on her shoulders with each step. The house, with its gleaming marble floors and towering chandeliers, felt different now. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was part of something much larger. Dominic had kept his word. She was no longer serving dinner or cleaning the rooms. Now, she was working directly with him, assisting in things no one else could handle. As the days went on, her responsibilities grew. She quickly found herself buried in legal papers, deciphering contracts, and sitting in on high-stakes meetings. But with each passing day, the tension in the air only seemed to grow. Dominic was a man of power and control, but there were cracks in his empire. Marissa could feel it in the way the conversations in the mansion had shifted. There were whispers of betrayal, murmurs of allies turning against him. Yet, in the midst of it all, Dominic remained unshaken. He was calm, composed, and in control. But even the calmest of leaders couldn't hide everything. One night, as she sat in his office reviewing another batch of contracts, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Marco, one of Dominic's closest bodyguards. Mr. Valentino wants you in his office, Marco said, his voice low and serious. Marissa followed Marco through the winding halls to Dominic's office. As they entered, she noticed that the air was thick with tension. Dominic sat at his desk, a pile of documents in front of him, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced with a hard edge. Close the door, Dominic ordered, his voice sharp. Marco did as instructed and stood by the door, keeping his distance. Marissa could feel the weight of Dominic's gaze as he looked up at her. There was a fire in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. I need you to go over these, he said, sliding a set of papers toward her. We're facing a situation, and I need someone who can think outside the box. Marissa took a seat across from him, her mind racing. She had seen enough to know that things were starting to unravel, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. She glanced down at the documents. It didn't take long for her to spot the problem. The contract was filled with clauses that gave the other party far more power than Dominic had realized. It was a trap, just like the one she had seen before. This is bad, Marissa muttered under her breath, not realizing that she had spoken aloud. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low but laced with urgency. This is exactly what happened to me, Marissa said, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. This contract gives them control over your entire operation. If you sign this, you're giving them the keys to the kingdom. Dominic's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the contract for a long moment. I thought I could trust them, he said finally, his voice quiet, almost to himself. Everyone I've trusted has turned on me. Marissa felt a flicker of sympathy for him, but she didn't allow it to show. She had seen what power did to people, how it twisted them, turned them into something they never meant to be. Dominic wasn't the man he once was, not since he had inherited the mantle of Mafia Boss after his father's death. But in this moment, he wasn't just the boss. He was a man who had been betrayed, and he was looking for someone to help him make things right. Marissa took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice firm. "I'll help you find the way out. But you need to trust me." Dominic looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he nodded. "I'm listening," he said. For the next few hours, Marissa worked alongside Dominic, going through each clause, each sentence, carefully analyzing the fine print. As they worked, the tension in the room seemed to ease. But only slightly. Dominic was no longer as composed as he once was. There was a vulnerability in him now, a crack in his armor that she hadn't seen before. It made her realize that, despite everything, Dominic Valentino was just a man who had been pushed to the edge, a man who had trusted the wrong people. As they finished going through the contract, Dominic sat back in his chair, a look of defeat in his eyes. "You've saved me," he said quietly. "But it's not enough. I've lost so much already." Marissa could see the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about the contract. It was about everything that had led him to this point. His father's death, the betrayal from within his own ranks, the constant power struggles. He had built an empire, but in the process, he had lost himself. "It's never too late," Marissa said softly, meeting his gaze. "You can fix this. You just have to trust the right people." Dominic nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a long silence between them before he finally spoke. "I want you to stay," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't know if I can trust anyone else, but I trust you." Marissa didn't know how to respond. She had never expected this, never thought she would find herself here, working with a man like Dominic Valentino. But something inside her stirred. She had spent so much of her life being invisible, hiding from the world, but now she was standing in the midst of it, making a difference. "I'm here," she said simply. And in that moment, she realized that this was just the beginning. The days following the tense contract review felt like a whirlwind to Marissa. She had barely left the office since Dominic had asked her to stay and help him navigate the storm brewing within his empire. The late nights blurred into early mornings, and the mansion, which had once seemed so imposing, now felt like a war room. Every corner held a quiet sense of urgency, a constant reminder of the battles Dominic was facing. Marissa found herself sitting across from him more often than not, analyzing papers, strategizing moves, and discussing the next steps. She had never been so deeply involved in anything before. The Mafia Boss, the man who had seemed so untouchable, was now counting on her to help him save his empire, and for the first time in a long time, Marissa felt like she had a purpose. But as the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. More and more of Dominic's allies began to distance themselves. The whispers that had once been rumors now felt like tangible threats, creeping into every conversation, every meeting. Marissa could see the strain in Dominic's eyes, the cracks in his unshakable exterior. He had always prided himself on his control, on the way he could manipulate the world around him with a single gesture, a quiet word. But now, he was starting to question everything. It wasn't just the business deals falling apart. It was his own people, the ones he had trusted most, turning their backs on him. One afternoon, as Marissa was reviewing a set of financial statements, Dominic walked into the room, his steps heavy. There was something different about him today, something in the way he carried himself, as if the weight of the world had become too much. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking out the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the back of a chair. Marissa looked up, sensing the shift. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice steady. Dominic turned to her, his expression unreadable. "They're starting to move against me," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I can feel it. The deals are falling apart, Marissa. I thought I could control everything. But now it's slipping away." Marissa stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. For a moment, he didn't move, but then he relaxed slightly under her touch. It was the first time he had let his guard down in front of her. "You've been through worse," she said, her voice reassuring. "You've come out on top before. You can do it again." Dominic looked at her, a flicker of something, maybe gratitude, maybe disbelief, crossing his face. "I don't know if I can do it alone," he admitted. "I've built this empire, but I've lost so much along the way. I'm not sure who I can trust anymore. Marissa felt a surge of empathy for him, despite the danger that surrounded him. She knew that Dominic's world was full of betrayal, but she had seen something in him that made her believe he could rise again. You don't have to do it alone, she said firmly. I'm here. We'll figure this out together. Dominic's eyes searched hers for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. All right, but this is going to get worse before it gets better. Are you sure you're ready for that? Marissa didn't hesitate. I've never been more ready. With that, Dominic sat down at his desk, pulling out a set of papers that had been waiting for him. He began to explain the next steps, how to solidify their position, how to deal with the threats from the inside, how to turn the tables on those who had already begun to plot against him. As Marissa listened, she realized that the weight of their work had just begun. This was more than just saving his empire. This was about changing the course of everything. The next few days were a blur of strategy and meetings. Marissa had never been so involved in high-stakes decision-making. She had been a part of the legal world once, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the consequences greater. And the further she went into this world, the more she understood what Dominic had sacrificed to get here, and what he was willing to sacrifice to keep it. One night, as they sat in his office, going over the final details of a major deal, Dominic looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. You've proven yourself, Marissa, he said, his voice low but serious. I'm not used to trusting people, especially not so quickly, but I trust you. Marissa looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. You can count on me, she replied, her voice steady. Dominic stood, walking to the window, his back to her. Good, he said softly, because I'm going to need all the help I can get. The tension in the air thickened, and Marissa knew that the next few days would determine everything. The cracks in Dominic's empire were growing, and the only way to fix it was to confront the betrayal head-on. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Dominic might have been the one with the power, but together, they could face whatever came next, and she was ready for it. The tension in the Valentino mansion had reached a boiling point. Marissa could feel it in the air as she sat at her desk in Dominic's private office. The papers in front of her were a blur, and her mind was racing with thoughts of their next move. The deal they had been working on for weeks was crumbling before their eyes. More allies were defecting, and the whispers of betrayal were no longer rumors. They were a harsh reality. Dominic was facing threats from all directions, and Marissa had become the one person he could rely on. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted, and she knew that something had to give. The Mafia Boss had always been a man of control, a man who wielded power effortlessly. But now, he was starting to crack. He had trusted too many people, and now they were turning their backs on him. Marissa had seen the change in him over the past few weeks. The once confident, unshakable leader now seemed unsure of himself, and it was her job to help him regain that control. She had learned quickly that in this world, trust was the most valuable commodity, and also the most dangerous. But Marissa wasn't just an observer anymore. She had become an integral part of Dominic's operation, and as the stakes grew higher, so did her role. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. That night, Dominic called her into his office. His voice on the phone was low, almost distant, but she could tell he was frustrated. When she entered, the first thing she noticed was the coldness in the room. He was sitting behind his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface. It was a sign that he was deep in thought, possibly contemplating his next move. I need you to take care of something, Dominic said without looking up. His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was an edge to it. Marissa nodded and stepped closer. What is it? She asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. I need you to deal with the business partners who've been leaking information. The ones who are trying to sell me out, Dominic said, his voice colder now. You've worked with them before. You know how to get what we need. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She had worked with Dominic's partners before, but she never imagined she would be asked to take matters into her own hands like this. She knew what he was asking, and she knew the consequences of failure. If she didn't handle this right, it could cost them everything. Understood, she said, her voice firm. Dominic finally looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. You're the only one I trust to do this, Marissa, he said, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. If we don't take care of this, everything we've built will fall apart. Marissa nodded again. She wasn't afraid, at least, not of Dominic's request. But she knew what it would take to handle this situation, and it wouldn't be easy. She would have to be smart, ruthless, and above all, careful. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice unwavering. Dominic studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge her resolve. Finally, he stood up and walked toward her. "I know you won't," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You've already proven yourself to me." Marissa couldn't help but feel a surge of pride at his words. But she pushed it aside. There was no time for pride. There was too much at stake. As she left Dominic's office, she felt the weight of the mission ahead of her. She had to find the leak, the traitor, and eliminate the threat before it brought them all down. But as she walked through the hallways of the mansion, a new sense of determination began to build inside her. She was no longer just a maid or a former lawyer. She was part of something bigger, something more dangerous. And she would do whatever it took to protect it. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and covert operations. Marissa worked tirelessly, gathering information, connecting the dots, and putting together a plan. She had never been involved in anything like this before, but she quickly realized that her legal background gave her an edge. She knew how to read people, how to spot a lie, and how to use the law to her advantage. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Marissa found herself facing a difficult decision. The traitor was someone she had worked with closely, someone she had trusted. But now, that trust had been shattered. She could feel the weight of the decision on her shoulders. If she confronted this person, it could be the end of their relationship and possibly the end of their lives. But Dominic's empire was at risk, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. The time had come to make a move. One night, after a long day of gathering information, Marissa finally met with the traitor in a secluded corner of the mansion. The conversation was short, but the words that were exchanged would change everything. "You've been playing both sides," Marissa said, her voice cold and calculated. The traitor's eyes widened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of fear. But then they quickly regained composure. "I didn't have a choice," the traitor said, their voice shaky. "It was either betray him or lose everything." Marissa's heart hardened. She had no sympathy for betrayal, especially not when it was aimed at someone like Dominic. "You chose wrong," she said, her voice low but firm. The traitor stepped back, their face pale. "Please, don't tell him. I'll do anything." Marissa didn't respond. She didn't need to. The decision had already been made. She knew what she had to do. She walked away from the conversation, leaving the traitor behind. There was no going back now. Dominic's empire was safe, for now. But Marissa knew that this was only the beginning. The danger was far from over. And as she returned to her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start of something much darker. The following week was a blur for Marissa. The air inside the Valentino mansion was charged with an unease that seemed to grow with every passing day. Dominic had successfully dealt with the immediate threats to his empire, but Marissa could sense that the real battle was only just beginning. The betrayal had been dealt with, but now there were more cracks to repair. The aftermath of their last move had left a trail of questions, whispers in the corridors, and eyes watching them from the shadows. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Dominic, the man who had once held absolute control over everything around him, was now surrounded by uncertainty. Marissa had always known that power was fragile, but she had never seen it so evident as she did now. She found herself walking beside Dominic more often, discussing strategies, making decisions together. The weight of those decisions pressed heavily on her. She could see that Dominic, for all his strength, was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The cracks in his facade were no longer subtle. They were becoming more apparent. One night, as they sat in his office, reviewing yet another deal that was on the verge of collapse, Dominic ran a hand through his hair, his usual sharp expression giving way to a look of frustration. "They won't stop," he muttered under his breath. "It's like they're waiting for me to slip." Marissa looked at him, her gaze softening. She had never seen him like this before. His empire had always been invincible in his eyes, but now, the walls were closing in. "They won't succeed," she said, her voice steady. "We'll make sure of it." Dominic met her gaze, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for something more than just reassurance. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure who to trust anymore." Marissa's heart tightened at his words. She had seen the burden he carried, the weight of leading an empire built on loyalty, fear, and power. It wasn't just the business that weighed him down. It was the constant threat of betrayal, the ever-present danger that came with being at the top. You don't have to do it alone, she said firmly. You never have to. Dominic sat back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, his fingers tapping the surface of the desk rhythmically. Then, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I've built this empire, but I've lost myself along the way. His words hit her harder than she expected. There was a vulnerability in them, a side of Dominic that she hadn't seen before. The ruthless mafia boss who controlled so much was now just a man, struggling with the very things that had made him who he was. Marissa didn't know what to say. She had never imagined that someone like him would ever open up like this. She had always seen him as untouchable, unshakable, but now she realized just how fragile that perception was. You're not alone, she repeated, her voice calm but strong. You still have your people. And you still have me. Dominic looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his thoughts hanging between them. Then, slowly he nodded. I don't know what I'd do without you, he said quietly. Marissa felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected this kind of connection, not in a world like theirs. But there was something in Dominic's words that made her realize how far they had come, how much they had both changed. She had started as a maid, just trying to survive. And now, she was here, standing beside the most powerful man in the city, helping him navigate the very empire he had built. And somehow, she had become more than just a part of his operation. She had become someone he trusted. The next few days brought more challenges. More deals to fix, more alliances to secure. But through it all, Dominic and Marissa worked together, each step forward solidifying their partnership. The mansion, once filled with tension, now felt like a place of quiet determination. Marissa could see that Dominic was starting to regain his confidence. He was no longer the man who questioned his every move. He was once again the mafia boss, the leader who had built this empire. But there was something different about him now. It wasn't just the power that he wielded. It was the way he looked at her, the way he trusted her. As they sat together late one evening, looking over the final details of a new contract that would secure their position, Dominic looked up at her, his gaze steady. We're not out of the woods yet, he said. But we're closer than we were. Marissa nodded, her resolve strengthening with every word. We'll get through this, she said, her voice firm. Together, Dominic's lips curved into a small smile, the first genuine smile she had seen in days. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight that had been hanging over them seemed to lift, just a little. But Marissa knew better than to believe the danger had passed. In their world, danger was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. And she was ready to face whatever came next. Dominic was right. They weren't out of the woods yet. But they were stronger now, and that made all the difference. As they moved forward, she knew that whatever happened, they would face it. Together. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, decisions, and tension. Dominic and Marissa worked tirelessly, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The mansion, once filled with the sound of quiet footsteps and whispers, now felt like a strategic battlefield. But even in the midst of all this chaos, there was something about Dominic that had changed. Marissa could feel it every time they spoke, every time they sat together. He was no longer just the powerful mafia boss. He was someone who had learned to trust, someone who had let down his guard just enough to rely on her. But as the power shifts and internal struggles intensified, danger was never far behind. The enemies that Dominic had once feared were no longer distant threats. They were within his inner circle, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as they sat in his office reviewing the final documents of a crucial deal, Dominic's phone rang. The tone was sharp, urgent, and as soon as he answered, his demeanor shifted. His face, which had been so composed just moments before, hardened instantly. Marissa watched him closely, her heart racing, knowing that whatever was on the other end of that call wasn't good. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Dominic said, his voice clipped, before he hung up. We've got a situation, he said, looking up at Marissa. I need you to come with me. Now. Marissa nodded without hesitation. This was what she had been preparing for. This was the moment that would define her place in this world. She stood up and followed him, her mind already working through the possible scenarios. What had gone wrong? Who had made the first move? Dominic's stride was purposeful, his face set in determination as he led her through the mansion. She could see the familiar intensity in his eyes, but there was something else there too, an edge of desperation that wasn't typical of him. They reached the garage, where two of Dominic's bodyguards were already waiting in an armored SUV. Without a word, they climbed in, and the vehicle sped off into the night. Marissa sat beside Dominic, her mind racing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The city passed by in a blur, the neon lights of the streetlights flashing by as the SUV navigated the winding roads. "Who is it?" Marissa finally asked, breaking the silence. "One of my most trusted men," Dominic replied, his voice low. "Someone I thought was loyal. But I've learned that loyalty is a currency that's always in short supply." Marissa couldn't help but notice the strain in his voice. The words seemed heavy, as if they carried more than just the weight of business. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety rising in her chest. "We'll handle it," Dominic corrected, glancing at her briefly. "This isn't just about trust. It's about survival." They arrived at a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they stepped out of the vehicle, surrounded by more armed guards. Dominic walked ahead, and Marissa followed closely behind, her senses heightened. The doors of the warehouse were already open, and inside, several men stood waiting. Among them was a familiar face, a man who had been working for Dominic for years, someone who had always been by his side. But now, his presence felt wrong, like a lie wrapped in a familiar face. "Lorenzo," Dominic said, his voice cold as he stepped forward. The man's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Boss," he said, his voice too smooth, too practiced. "What brings you here?" Dominic didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Lorenzo for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Marissa could see the tension building in the air. She had seen this before, the moment when trust had been broken, when allegiances shifted. "You've been playing both sides, haven't you?" Dominic's voice was low, but the accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Lorenzo's face remained unreadable, but Marissa could see the way his hands twitched slightly. He was nervous. "I don't know what you mean," Lorenzo said, his voice faltering for just a second. Dominic took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the man in front of him. "I've seen the evidence," he said, his tone unwavering. "You've been working with my enemies, leaking information. I trusted you." Lorenzo shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the other men in the room. The guards were waiting, their expressions cold and impassive. The room was thick with anticipation. "Boss, Lorenzo began, but Dominic cut him off. "No excuses." He stepped forward again, this time with a slow, deliberate movement. "You're a liability now, and I can't afford to let you walk out of here." Marissa felt a chill run down her spine. The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening. It was clear that Dominic had made his decision. There would be no second chances. "I did what I had to do," Lorenzo said, his voice shaking now, the bravado gone. "I didn't want to, but they promised me." He trailed off, his words lost in the gravity of the situation. Dominic raised his hand, silencing him. "You don't get to explain yourself. Not anymore." He turned to one of the guards, his voice calm but final. "Take care of it." The guard nodded and moved forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. Marissa watched as the situation unfolded, the cold finality of it settling into her bones. She had never been a part of something like this before, but now she understood the harsh reality of the world she had stepped into. As the men moved to deal with the traitor, Dominic turned to her, his expression hardening again. "This is how it has to be," he said. "We can't afford weakness." Marissa nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I understand." As they left the warehouse, Marissa realized just how much had changed since she had first walked into the mansion. The stakes were higher now, the danger more real. But she also knew something else, that she was in this world for good, and she would do whatever it took to survive it. The following days felt heavier than ever. The decision to deal with Lorenzo had shaken everyone in the mansion, but none more than Dominic. For the first time since Marissa had worked closely with him, she saw the weariness in his eyes that no amount of power could hide. The room was quiet when she entered his office, a silence that had become all too familiar since the betrayal. He was sitting behind his desk, staring at a document, but his focus seemed distant, lost in thought. Marissa stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment. She could feel the weight of what had just transpired between them. She knew it had to be done, but even she couldn't ignore the heaviness of the task. The room was colder than usual, a stark contrast to the warmth of the day outside. "You're still up?" she asked softly, crossing the room and sitting across from him. Dominic glanced up at her, his eyes slightly red, as if he hadn't slept in days. "I don't know how to stop it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been fighting for so long, Marissa. But I can feel it now. The walls closing in." Marissa took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "You're not alone in this. I'm here. We're here. We'll get through this together." Dominic's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze shifting back to the papers in front of him. "I've pushed so many people away, Marissa. There's no turning back now." There was a hint of regret in his voice that she hadn't heard before. It was clear that the weight of leading the empire had taken more from him than he was willing to admit. The power, the control, the betrayal, it was all catching up with him. "You've done what you had to do," she said firmly. "But you can't do it all alone." Dominic's eyes softened as he met her gaze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, but in that silence, Marissa saw the vulnerability he had been hiding all this time. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was Dominic, the man who had given everything to build something he could never hold on to forever. "I've made so many enemies, Marissa," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I thought I could control it, but it's slipping through my fingers. The loyalty, the trust, it was all just a facade." Marissa shook her head, her voice gentle but strong. "No, you've built something real. You just need to trust the right people. Trust those who are still with you." Dominic looked at her, as if weighing her words, and for a brief moment, she saw something in him, something more than just the powerful Mafia boss. It was the man behind the mask, the one who had fought to survive. The man who had lost his way but was starting to find it again. "I've been fighting for so long that I don't even know who I am anymore," he confessed. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. Marissa didn't answer right away. She sat there, letting his words sink in. She could feel the strain in the air, the unspoken tension between them. It was in that moment that she realized how much their lives had changed, how far they had both come. "I can help you find your way again," she said softly. "But you have to let me." For the first time in a long while, Dominic smiled, though it was small and fleeting. He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. The night sky stretched out before him, the city below buzzing with life. He stared out for a long while, and Marissa sat quietly, waiting. Finally, he turned around. "I don't know if I deserve to be saved," he said quietly. "I've done things that can't be undone." "Everyone deserves a chance," Marissa replied, her voice steady. "And you've still got time." He nodded, but the uncertainty in his eyes remained. "I've made too many mistakes," he said, his voice heavy. "Too many people have betrayed me, and I'm not sure who to trust anymore." Marissa stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Trust me," she said quietly. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, they both understood the weight of those words. In that brief exchange, Marissa knew that the trust they shared was more than just a professional bond. It was something deeper, something that had formed through the struggles they had faced together. Dominic turned back to the window, his face softened, but the determination was returning to his eyes. "You're right," he said, his voice steady now. "I can't do this alone." Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected to be the one to help him find his way. She had only wanted to survive, but now, standing next to him, she realized that she had become a part of something much bigger, a part of Dominic's fight to reclaim his empire, his honor, and his future. Together, they would face whatever came next. The dangers were far from over. But in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet of the night, it felt like they had already won. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Marissa and Dominic were in this fight together, and they would not back down. The days following the decision to confront Lorenzo were tense, but they also marked a shift in the atmosphere around the Valentino mansion. Marissa could feel it in every room she walked into. There was a renewed sense of purpose, an unspoken understanding that they had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Dominic, despite the lingering shadows of doubt in his eyes, was more determined than ever. The plans were set in motion, and they were taking action against the enemies who had slowly infiltrated his empire. Marissa had never imagined she would be in the midst of such a whirlwind, but now, with every passing day, she felt the pull of the life she had become part of. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about loyalty, power, and what they could rebuild together. But that didn't mean it would be easy. A week after the confrontation with Lorenzo, Marissa found herself once again sitting across from Dominic in his office. The papers that once seemed like a mere formality now carried the weight of their future. He was reviewing another contract, this one more important than the last, a deal that would either solidify their position or send them into a dangerous downward spiral. Dominic looked up at her as she sat down, his expression as intense as it had been when they first met. "There's something about this deal that doesn't sit right with me," he said, his voice low. "The terms are too favorable to them. It feels like a setup, like they're trying to pull me into something I can't control." Marissa's instincts kicked in immediately. "Let me take a look," she said. Dominic pushed the contract toward her, and she scanned it quickly, her eyes trained to pick up on the fine print, the subtle clues that others might miss. As she read through the terms, she felt a tightening in her chest. It was a trap, another calculated move designed to force Dominic into a corner, to weaken him when he was most vulnerable. "You're right," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she had just uncovered. "This contract is lopsided. They've rigged the terms so you'll be held liable for everything, even if they don't fulfill their part. If you sign this, you'll be stuck in an endless cycle of legal battles." Dominic clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "I've been through enough of these games. Why is it always like this? No matter how hard I work, someone's always trying to tear it all down." Marissa looked at him, her eyes softening. "Because they're scared of you, Dominic. They want to take you down before you get too powerful. But that's not going to happen. Not as long as you have people who will fight for you." There was a pause, and for a brief moment, Dominic seemed to let his guard down. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as if the weight of the world was bearing down on him once again. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I've built something incredible, but I'm losing everything I've worked for." Marissa took a deep breath and stood up, walking over to him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. She understood the weight of what he was going through. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly. "We're in this together. I'll help you navigate it, whatever it takes." Dominic looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that, for the first time, resembled hope. "I never thought I'd find someone I could trust again," he said. "Not after everything that's happened." Marissa smiled softly, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "You're not just building an empire, Dominic. You're building something real. And I'm not going to let anyone take that from you." The next few days were filled with late-night meetings and countless calls. They made their move against the ones who had tried to undermine them, gathering their allies and securing the loyalty of those who had remained true. But as the deal with their enemies began to unfold, things took a dangerous turn. A new threat emerged, one that was more personal than any they had faced before. Marissa had known that the stakes were high, but she hadn't expected the betrayal to come from within. One evening, Dominic's trusted advisor, Michael, called her into his office, his face grave. "We've got a problem," he said. "There's a leak. Someone's been feeding information to our enemies." Marissa's stomach dropped. She had known that the danger was always there, lurking in the shadows, but she hadn't expected it to come from someone they had considered a friend. "Who?" she asked her, voice low. Michael looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know yet, but we have to find out before it's too late." The next few days were a whirlwind of investigation and subtle interrogations. Marissa worked tirelessly to uncover the identity of the traitor. The walls were closing in on them again, and it felt like they were constantly fighting an invisible enemy. As they pieced together the clues, the truth finally came to light. It was someone they had trusted, someone close to Dominic. The realization hit hard, and for the first time, Marissa saw the weight of betrayal on Dominic's face. But this time, there would be no hesitation. "We can't let this slide," Dominic said, his voice cold. "We deal with it now, before it destroys everything we've built." Marissa nodded, her resolve hardening. They had fought too hard, come too far to let anyone tear it all down now. They would find the traitor, and they would eliminate the threat before it had a chance to strike. The battle was far from over, but this time, they were ready. The investigation into the leak had taken a toll on both Dominic and Marissa. The walls that had seemed so sturdy, the network of alliances they had spent years cultivating, were now crumbling under the weight of betrayal. Every moment felt like a ticking clock. As they delved deeper into the web of lies, it became clear that they were dealing with someone who had carefully positioned themselves within Dominic's inner circle. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. The traitor wasn't some outsider. It was someone who had worked alongside them for years. Marissa had hoped she was wrong, but the signs pointed to only one person, Victor. He had been Dominic's right-hand man for years, the one person he trusted above all others. The man who had helped him build the empire from the ground up. And now, Victor was the one feeding information to their enemies. Dominic had always been cautious, always wary of the wolves in sheep's clothing. But this time, the betrayal was too close to home. The realization hit him hard. He had trusted Victor with everything, and Victor had used that trust to slowly tear apart the very foundation of his empire. As the truth sank in, Dominic's face hardened. He had built his empire with his own hands, through sweat and blood, and now someone he considered family had turned on him. The pain of that realization was almost physical, but it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the threat it posed to everything they had worked for. "We can't let this go on any longer," Dominic said, his voice cold. "Victor needs to be dealt with." Marissa nodded, her expression as hard as his. She had seen the toll this was taking on him, but she also knew that they couldn't afford to let this linger. They had to act, and they had to act fast. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady. "We can't waste time. We have to eliminate the threat." Dominic turned to her, his eyes searching hers. There was a moment of silence, as if he were trying to decide whether to trust her with this final, dangerous task. But then, his gaze softened, and he nodded. "I trust you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do what needs to be done." Marissa didn't waste another second. She went to work immediately, organizing the resources and contacts they would need to confront Victor. It wasn't going to be easy. Victor was smart, cunning, and had a network of loyal supporters. But Marissa knew how to navigate the shadows, how to use the system to her advantage. She had done it before, and she would do it again. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Marissa and a small team of trusted allies made their way to Victor's hideout, a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city. The moonlight reflected off the glass windows, casting an eerie glow over the property. They moved quietly, blending into the night, each step measured and calculated. This wasn't just about exposing a traitor. This was about taking back control, about showing everyone who doubted them that they were still in charge. As they neared the mansion, Marissa's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air. They had to move quickly, decisively. The risk of failure was high, but the cost of letting Victor go free was far greater. Marissa motioned to her team to spread out and cover all exits. She moved toward the front door, her mind focused on the task at hand. As she stepped inside, the faint sound of voices drifted through the hallways. Victor and his men were inside, discussing the final stages of their betrayal. Marissa's heart raced. She had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. But she was calm, focused. She had been in worse situations before. This was just another obstacle to overcome. She made her way to the study, where she knew Victor would be. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and there he was, sitting behind a large oak desk, surrounded by paperwork. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her. "Marissa," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" There was no fear in his voice, only confusion. He didn't know what was coming. "You know why I'm here," Marissa replied, her voice cold. "You've been playing both sides, Victor. And now, it's time to pay for your betrayal." Victor stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "This was never personal. I had no choice. You don't understand the pressure I was under. They promised me power, freedom, everything I've ever wanted." Marissa didn't flinch. She had heard all the excuses before. "You made your choice," she said. "And now you have to face the consequences." She stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "It's over, Victor. You've crossed a line." Victor's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The walls were closing in. "You can't do this," he said, his voice cracking. You can't kill me. I'm too valuable to you. Marissa shook her head, a small, almost sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. You were valuable, she said quietly. But you're a liability now. And in this world, we don't keep liabilities. With one swift motion, she gave the signal to her team. The operation was clean, efficient, and final. Within minutes, Victor was no longer a threat. The traitor was dealt with, and Dominic's empire was safe, for now. As Marissa stood over the man who had once been so trusted, she felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. This was just the reality of the world they lived in. And as long as Dominic remained at the top, there would always be enemies lurking in the shadows. The battle was far from over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The night after dealing with Victor felt different. The air around the Valentino mansion seemed to have shifted, as if it too understood the weight of the decision that had been made. Dominic had reclaimed control, but at what cost? Marissa could see the subtle change in him. The once unshakable mafia boss who had always exuded power now seemed haunted, weighed down by the reality of his position. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the constant battle for dominance, the uncertainty of who could be trusted. The war was far from over. As the days passed, Marissa kept a close eye on the inner workings of the operation. She had become an integral part of Dominic's strategy, not just because of her legal expertise, but because of the trust that had developed between them. For the first time, she wasn't just a passive player in the background. She was at the forefront, navigating the risks with Dominic, and they were slowly regaining control over the territory they had almost lost. But with every victory came a new challenge. The power struggle within the organization was far from settled. Whispers of dissent still lingered, and every ally was a potential enemy in disguise. Dominic's enemies were no longer just rival families. They were people within his own ranks, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a dangerous game, and Marissa knew it was only a matter of time before someone else would attempt to take advantage of Dominic's vulnerability. One afternoon, as they sat in his office, discussing the future of the family's operations, Dominic's phone rang. His expression changed instantly, the familiar coldness returning to his face as he answered. Marissa could sense the shift in the room as soon as the call ended. Dominic's jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something Marissa couldn't quite place. It's Lorenzo, he said quietly, his voice edged with tension. He's making a move. Marissa's stomach dropped. She had known that there would be repercussions after the way Victor had been handled. But Lorenzo, one of the most influential figures in the city, was not someone who could be ignored. He had his own plans, his own network of power, and he wasn't going to let Dominic's actions slide without retaliation. What's he after? Marissa asked, her voice steady despite the unease that had settled in her chest. Dominic's eyes narrowed, his thoughts clearly racing as he sifted through the possibilities. He's making a play for our territory, he said, his voice laced with frustration. He's offering deals to our allies, trying to buy them off. It's a move to weaken us from within. Marissa stood up, her mind already working through the potential moves they could make. She knew that this was more than just a business conflict. It was a direct challenge to Dominic's leadership, and it had to be stopped before it tore everything down. We need to strike first, she said, her voice low and resolute. If we wait, it'll be too late. Dominic turned to her, his expression hardening. You're right, he said, his voice gaining strength. We take back what's ours. As the plans were set in motion, Marissa found herself once again in the midst of a high-stakes game. They would have to outsmart Lorenzo, play him at his own game, and show their power. But there was something else at play, something more personal. Dominic was changing, and Marissa could see it. The man who had once ruled with an iron fist was now starting to question everything he had built. And that was a dangerous thing. The next few days were a blur of meetings, strategy, and planning. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Every move had to be calculated, every word chosen carefully. Dominic's mind was sharp, but there was a restlessness in his movements, a sign that the pressure was taking its toll. Marissa could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the uncertainty that crept into his decisions. And she couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who held everything together. But now, it seemed as if he was searching for something that he couldn't find. As they prepared to confront Lorenzo and his forces, Marissa found herself standing by Dominic's side more than ever. She had come to realize that they were no longer just allies in business. They were bound by something deeper, something more personal. Dominic's world was dark, dangerous, and full of betrayal, but for the first time, Marissa felt like she truly understood him. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for him, for everything they had built together. The night of the confrontation arrived, and Marissa stood beside Dominic in a darkened alley, the tension in the air palpable. Their forces had gathered, ready to strike. The confrontation would be swift, decisive, but also full of risks. Lorenzo wouldn't back down easily, and Marissa knew this would be a battle like no other. As the minutes ticked by, Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the street ahead, his jaw set in determination. But there was something else there, something vulnerable. Marissa could feel it, even if he didn't acknowledge it. She placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. He glanced at her, his expression softening for a brief moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the first time he had shown any sign of appreciation, and Marissa's heart clenched. She had never asked for his gratitude, but hearing those words from him made her realize just how far they had come. The night was still young, and the danger was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Marissa felt like they were on the same side, and that made all the difference. The tension in the air was palpable as Dominic and Marissa stood together, waiting for the confrontation with Lorenzo and his forces to unfold. The alleyway was dimly lit, the only sound being the distant hum of the city's nightlife. Marissa could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the pivotal moment, the one that would determine the future of Dominic's empire, and she wasn't sure what to expect. She had seen Dominic at his most powerful, but now, standing beside him, she saw a different side of him. There was a flicker of vulnerability behind his eyes, something that had always been hidden by his cold, calculated demeanor. He was used to being the one in control, the one who made the decisions. But now it was different. Marissa could sense the uncertainty in him, the feeling that everything he had worked for was on the verge of slipping away. "We're not backing down." Dominic's voice broke the silence, as if he had read her thoughts. He was staring ahead, his jaw clenched. "No matter what happens tonight, we finish this." Marissa nodded, her mind racing. She had seen the cracks in the empire, the betrayals, the whispers, but she also knew what Dominic was capable of. He had built this empire from the ground up, and he wasn't going to let anyone tear it down now. "We'll make sure of it," she said, her voice steady. Dominic glanced at her, a brief flicker of something softer in his eyes, but it was gone before she could register it. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss had returned, and with it, the determination to win. The sound of footsteps echoed down the alley, and Dominic's gaze hardened. The moment had arrived. They had to act fast, or all would be lost. The door to the warehouse at the end of the alley creaked open, and a group of armed men stepped out. Lorenzo was at the forefront, his smug expression a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere surrounding them. He didn't speak at first, just looked at Dominic with an almost pitying gaze. "So this is it." Lorenzo's voice was low, mocking. "You're willing to go this far to protect what's left of your empire?" Dominic stood his ground, his posture unwavering. "I've built everything you see, Lorenzo, and I'll burn it all to the ground before I let you take it." Lorenzo chuckled darkly, taking a step forward. "You've lost, Dominic. You've always been too arrogant to see it. Your empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do about it." Marissa could feel the tension rising, the air thick with the weight of the threat. She knew that this wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was a battle for survival, and she wasn't about to let Dominic lose. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Lorenzo." Marissa spoke up, her voice sharp. "You think you can just waltz in and take what's not yours, but you're wrong. This is our city, and if you think you can walk away from this, you're sadly mistaken." Lorenzo's eyes flicked to her, his smirk never wavering. "And who are you to speak to me like that?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just the maid who got lucky." Marissa didn't flinch. "I'm not just a maid, and I'm not just lucky. I'm someone who's fought for everything I've got, and I'm not letting you take it from us." The standoff lasted only a few moments, but to Marissa, it felt like hours. She could see the uncertainty creeping into Lorenzo's eyes now. He had underestimated them both. Dominic and Marissa were no longer just a pair of people working to maintain an empire. They had become a force to be reckoned with. "This is over, Lorenzo," Dominic finally said, his voice low and cold. "I gave you every opportunity to walk away, but you chose to make this personal. Now, you'll pay the price." With a signal, the guards moved into position, flanking Lorenzo and his men. Marissa stood by Dominic's side, watching as the situation unfolded. She knew that this moment would define their future. The guards moved swiftly, disarming Lorenzo's men and securing the area. Lorenzo, however, wasn't ready to surrender. He lunged toward Dominic, but before he could make a move, Marissa stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "It's over," she said again, her voice unwavering. She had come a long way from the woman who had first entered this world, uncertain and afraid. Now, she was a force in her own right, and she wasn't going to let anyone threaten the life they had built. Dominic's eyes met hers for a brief moment, a flicker of something that might have been pride in them, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Take him away," Dominic ordered, his voice firm. Lorenzo's defiant expression faltered as he was led away by the guards. For the first time, Marissa allowed herself a small breath of relief. It was over, or so she thought. The next few hours were spent tying up loose ends, securing their position, and making sure that no one could challenge them again. But as the sun began to rise, Dominic pulled Marissa aside, his expression somber. "We've won this battle," he said quietly. "But the war isn't over. There are always more enemies. Always someone waiting for us to slip." Marissa nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The fight for control, for survival, was never truly over. But at least, for now, they had won. And as she stood by Dominic's side, ready for whatever came next, she knew that they would face it together. The days after their victory over Lorenzo were filled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The mansion, once buzzing with whispers of betrayal and doubt, now seemed quieter, more subdued. The threat had been eliminated, but the weight of leadership still pressed down on Dominic. He had faced numerous battles in his life, but this one had been different. Marissa could see it in his eyes. Despite the victory, there was a lingering sense of unease, the feeling that the fight was far from over. Dominic had built his empire through blood, sweat, and betrayal. But now, as he stood at the top, it felt like the world around him was constantly shifting, ready to turn on him at any moment. As they walked through the mansion one evening, Marissa noticed the distance that had slowly crept between them. They had been so focused on surviving, on maintaining control, that they had both lost sight of everything else. The empire, the power, the enemies, all of it had consumed them. "We've won this battle," Dominic said, breaking the silence between them. "But the war isn't over." Marissa nodded, knowing he was right. The streets were quieter now, but that only meant the danger was waiting, just beneath the surface, ready to rise again. The deal they had secured with their allies was fragile. There were still rival families who wanted to take what was rightfully theirs, and those who had once been loyal could easily turn. Marissa had become more than just a partner in business. She had become Dominic's closest confidant, the one person he trusted more than anyone else. It wasn't just loyalty anymore, it was something deeper. But even that wasn't enough to shield them from what was coming. Late one night, as they sat in his office, going over more contracts and planning their next move, Dominic looked up at Marissa, his face more serious than she had ever seen it. "I need to ask something of you," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I need to know if you're ready for what comes next." Marissa met his gaze, her heart suddenly racing. She had never seen him this vulnerable. He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions, but now he was asking for her input, her partnership in a way that felt more personal than ever. "I'm with you, Dominic. You know that," she said, her voice unwavering. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." He nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's not just about power anymore," he said, almost to himself. "It's about what I've lost along the way." Marissa felt a pang in her chest. She had seen Dominic's struggles, the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. She had watched him lose everything, his father, his innocence, his trust in others, but she had never seen him question himself like this. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "You haven't lost everything," she said softly. "You still have your empire, your people, and most of all, you have me." Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded slowly. I can't keep doing this alone, he admitted. I never wanted to drag anyone into this world, but it's too late now. I need you by my side, Marissa. I trust you more than anyone. Her heart swelled at his words. She had always known that their partnership was more than just business, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. I'm here, Dominic, she said, her voice steady. I've always been here. With that, they both understood the gravity of their situation. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for each other, for the future they could build together. It wasn't going to be easy. They both knew that. The enemies were still out there, waiting, plotting their next move. But for the first time, they had a sense of unity, of purpose that went beyond their empire. The bond they had formed, through betrayal, through loyalty, was stronger than anything else. The night was still young, and the weight of the world was still pressing down on them. But together, they were ready. The next few days brought new challenges, new decisions, but each time they faced an obstacle, they did so side by side. As they met with their allies and solidified their position, Marissa saw the change in Dominic. The uncertainty had lifted from his eyes. He was back in control, but this time, he wasn't alone. The empire they had built together was stronger than ever. And as they stood at the top, ready for whatever came next, Marissa knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but with each other by their side, they could conquer anything. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And this time, they would fight it as one. In this thrilling tale of power, betrayal, and unexpected love, we follow the journey of a man who built an empire from the ground up, only to face challenges from both outside and within. As the Mafia Boss, he has always been in control, but when betrayal comes from someone he trusted most, his world begins to unravel. Enter the Maid, a woman with a sharp mind and an unwavering determination to protect what they've both fought for. As their paths intertwine, they discover a connection that transcends business and power struggles. This story is more than just a fight for dominance. It's a deep dive into the complex emotions of loyalty, trust, and the transformative power of love. Through every challenge, betrayal, and hard decision, they face their enemies together, learning that the strongest bond is built not just on power, but on trust and mutual respect. Romance stories like this one are not just about the characters, but the emotional depth they explore, showing how love can emerge even in the most dangerous situations. This captivating narrative will keep you on the edge of your seat, wondering how far they will go to protect their world, each other, and the love that's blossomed between them. In the world of organized crime, where every alliance is fragile, it's the unexpected romance that offers them a chance at redemption. As the story unfolds, we see how, in the face of adversity, the most powerful force can be the connection between two people. Whether in the high-stakes world of a mafia empire or in the quiet moments of genuine connection, romance stories remind us that love can thrive even in the darkest of times.